Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we are joined by Delani Bartlette. She is the author of The Dumond Affair: How Lies and Politics Freed a Killer. This story gets into political corruption and religious zealotry that gave birth to an anti-Bill Clinton conspiracy theory complex that led to the deaths of two women and very, very much more. The whole thing starts in 84. We're going to get into it. Um, and this stretches over decades and apparently culminates in 2020. It's going to be a crazy thing, but we're going to learn all about Delani and the book and how she came to write this whole story. It seems fascinating. So, welcome to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you so much. So, why don't we start from the beginning? Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and the book?
Well, I'm a native Arkansan. I've lived in Northwest Arkansas pretty much my whole life. And so I remember the Dumond case when it was a case, and then when it came back around in 2008 with Mike Huckabee. Um, but what really got me fired up to write this book was when Pizzagate happened, and I heard so many in the mainstream media who were just absolutely flabbergasted of like, why would someone believe that Hillary Clinton runs a pedophile ring and does satanic rituals and all this garbage? And I felt like I was in the back of the classroom going, me, over here. I know where it started. And so I just felt like I needed to kind of shine a light on where a lot of this stuff started. And so that was the impetus for me to write this book.
Fantastic. Yes, I used to have family that lived down that way. I spent most of my childhood down there. So I was one of the reasons I took this is because I recognized it immediately. I'm like, oh, someone finally wrote about that, and um yeah, it's just like many people don't understand that if it weren't for the Whitewater land deal, we would not know who Monica Lewinsky is. Like
Right.
Ken Starr couldn't find anything illegal in Whitewater, which is a land deal they lost money on. And because
Yeah.
they couldn't find anything, that's when they discovered the affair. Literally, if it hadn't have been for a bad land deal, we would not know who she is. Have no
Yeah.
clue. She would be Monica Q Public like that,
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, there's a lot of kind of very odd, weird conceptions about them. But why don't we start from the beginning? Why don't you tell us how this all begins? It's 1984. Go.
Okay. So a young lady named Ashley Stevens, she's 17 years old. She's a cheerleader at Forest City High School. Forest City is a smallish city, southern Arkansas in the Delta region. And she walks home because it's the 80s. It's the
Mhm.
one day of week when she is a latchkey kid, when she comes home to an empty house. But she's 17. It's a safe neighborhood. She gets home. She said she kind of turned the TV on, took her shoes off, was sort of doing homework, waiting for friends to call, when suddenly this man walks through her screen door into her house. And he has a gun and he forces her into her car, forces her to like lay down in the seat so that no one can see that she's in the car. He's got the gun on her the whole time. He drives her to this secluded area, which you kind of get the impression that he had picked out beforehand because of the way that he drove past it, but then he turned around. So, um, and there he sexually assaults her. Um, and then he threatens to take her life, and she begs with him and claims that she's only 16, says that her mother has cancer. She's just kind of trying to say anything she can to play on his sympathies. And it works because he does take her back to her house, drops her off, gets in his truck, drives away. She got a good look at his truck, red Ford pickup truck. Um, so she calls the police, makes a statement. Um, she has a At first she has one of the better experiences that many sexual assault victims don't have, is that she was pretty much believed right away. The police, actually kind of to their detriment, they didn't really dig as hard into it as they should have. They didn't, you know talk to any of the neighbors. They just kind of like went to the crime scene where she showed them what happened. They dusted her car for fingerprints and they took biological samples from her clothes. Well, they showed her some lineups, some, photo lineups, and she didn't pick anybody out. In one, she said, well, this guy kind of looks like him, but she didn't say that's him. She just said he looks like this guy. Um, so a few weeks go by and she's driving around town with a friend and she sees that red pickup truck drive past her. She sees her attacker driving in the driver's seat and is immediately like, that's him, that's him. They write down the license plate number, go back to the cops, and the cops are able to trace that to Wayne Dumond.
Hmm.
So Wayne Dumond, he had a long history of this kind of thing. I was able to talk to some people who knew him back in like high school days, and he had long been known as not just a bully and a petty criminal, but he had sexually assaulted more than one girl at his high school. It was kind of became known to just stay away from him and his orange van. But anyway, he is taken to the station. Ashley identifies him. Yes, that's him. No question. He's turned loose on bond, awaiting trial. And then the probably most notorious fact about this case happens while he's out on bail.
Hmm.
So he's at home by himself when two men bust into his house, hog tie him, and castrate him, and leave him there for dead to bleed out. But fortunately for him, his two sons came home and found him, untied him. They were able to call the ambulance, and he was taken to get medical care, and obviously survived. Um, the interesting thing is that when the sheriff of the county, his name was Coolidge Conley, shows up to this crime scene, he sees Wayne Dumond's testicles on the ground and scoops them up in a matchbox and then just takes off with them. And for months afterwards, he displayed those testicles in a jar of formaldehyde in his office to literally anyone he could rope in to see these things. So that kind of became the most talked about part of the crime. So I don't know if you wanted to go any more into that or the sheriff or whatever.
Well, I would say, I mean, I'm sitting over here laughing because I'm kind of like, to a lot of people, that's going to seem like a very odd set of circumstances. Um, but and to be kind of, so all this type of thing. And I'm sitting here laughing to be kind of like, yeah, that's typical Southern behavior. My mom's from West Texas. So that's,
Oh,
so it's, I'm just kind of like, yeah, that'll seem shocking to some, but it's like, yeah, that's sadly rather, yeah, I can totally see that happening. And I'm sure it was much talked about and all this sort of thing. But so eventually he gets to trial, though.
yeah. And the judge in the case said that the defense could not bring up the fact that he had been castrated. His house had also been burned down while he was out on bail. Him and his family had left because they didn't feel safe, which, was not wrong.
Right.
So they just said that would be prejudicial and had nothing to do with whether or not he was guilty of the underlying crime, the rape and kidnapping of Ashley Stevens.
Hmm.
And he has his day in court and he's found guilty. And based on a lot of different things, but he's sentenced to life without possibility of parole. And so that's where, in a normal true crime story, yay, the perpetrator went to jail and now everything's over. But that is literally just the beginning of this crazy story.
Yes, yes, that's yeah, so we have so just to recap, we have raping kidnapping situation. We have what my mother would refer to as Southern justice, and which is why I'm sitting over like, kind of like, yeah, 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 sort of thing. And then we have this guilty verdict sort of thing. And ordinarily we would say, well, thanks everyone for coming on the Cameron Drill podcast. It's been lovely to
Yeah.
have you, sort of thing. But if anyone's checking a time clock, we're only 15 minutes into this. So, of course, there's more. So, what
Yes.
happens next?
So what happens next is that Wayne's wife, Dusty, um, is an absolute force. She is convinced that her man is innocent. This is a case of mistaken identity. She blames the sheriff, Coolidge Conley, because Conley is just cartoonishly corrupt. I go into it more in the book, but
Yeah.
if you think about every stereotype of the crooked Southern sheriff, he is all of those things. And
Payoffs for certain things, favors to friends, looking the
yeah,
other way on so and so's domestic violence situation. Yes, 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 yes,
yeah,
yes. Yeah,
engaging in cheating on card games and crap games and
yeah.
extorting black owned businesses and, brutalizing prisoners in the county jail. Like they
Of course,
literally name
yes.
it. Yeah. And he's
Yeah,
doing all these things.
right.
Um, so anyway, Dusty is in real tight with the Southern evangelical community, which in Arkansas is a pretty powerful group of people.
Well, there's a church on every corner and they're all full.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And so, because she's in really tight with the evangelical community, she kind of starts this crusade, pun intended,
Mhm.
to free her husband because he's an innocent man. And when it comes out that Ashley Stevens is a distant relative of then Governor Bill Clinton, that's all they needed. From that point on, they are the people who are pushing for his release are kind of fixated on this idea that this is all somehow Bill Clinton's doing to, sort of railroad this innocent man. And he was probably behind having him castrated. And he's just, Bill Clinton runs this state like a mob boss. And so it began to get, circulated amongst first the evangelical community through there was a crazy preacher here in Fayetteville who had an AM talk radio show, which if you're old enough and you remember AM talk radio,
Yeah.
there's a lot of that. He would go on his show and advocate for Wayne Dumond. He hated Bill Clinton, like with a passion, because
Yes.
Bill was, he had spoken out against the Vietnam War. He was pro civil rights, very beloved by the Black community in Arkansas as a general rule.
Of course.
And Hillary was a avowed feminist. She didn't change her last name. She didn't wear makeup. She had her own law practice. Scandal. And so the really fundamentalist types really, really hated the Clintons. So it did not take much to convince them that this was all somehow Bill Clinton's doing. And so it just, kind of snowballed. It just kept getting passed around and passed around that this poor guy is the victim of this crooked, corrupt Clinton, machine, blah,
Hmm.
blah, blah. And then once Clinton sets his sights on the presidency, um, Lee Atwater, who, if you know your history, was a Republican operative since the days of Reagan and probably before the days of Reagan.
Yeah, he
He
started out in the Nixon administration.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
So he sees Clinton and sees that this is a real threat, because not only is he a Southerner, but he's young, he's charismatic, he's popular. Like they got to take this guy down. And so this sort of begins this like decades long project of smearing the Clintons. And they have like, they start with Bill Clinton, but Hillary's never far behind. She was always seen as, if not the puppet master, like there literally would be political cartoons of Hillary Clinton literally like with her hand up Bill Clinton's butt
Well,
like he's the
and let's also, I
marionette.
mean, and let's also not forget, especially in the night, like, eh, Hillary Clinton was a subject of vitriol on every right-wing talk show, even more than Bill. Every right-wing talk show 24/7. Rush Limbaugh could not keep that woman's name out of his mouth. Um,
Yeah.
and the same thing goes for Michael Medved, Michael Savage, Laura Ingraham when she came along. um Hugh Hewitt. I mean, all of these, I grew up with these people,
Yes.
sort of thing. I mean, I mean, absolutely, I mean, they were absolutely convinced she was some sort of evil master. When they got into the White House, people complained that her hair wasn't attractive, she needed a new style, so they actually eventually convinced her to put it in a different style and dye it blonde and all this sort of, I mean, it was just absolute. Yeah, I mean, I don't think any, honestly, Hillary Clinton lives rent free in the minds of many Republicans from that era. Like,
Oh,
so
yeah.
people don't, I mean, people think that things are crazy. Now, it was quite the way the fixation the Republican Party had on that woman in particular in the 90s was in the extreme.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's how this kind of plays out is that um, because of their hatred for Hillary Clinton, that is literally what got us the Citizens United decision in 2010. So when you hear people talk about the corruption of all this money that's been flowing into politics, that gets traced back to the 2010 Citizens United Supreme Court decision that said that corporations are people and money is speech. And that just kind of opened the door to basically legalizing bribery. Well, Citizens United was a right wing organization. And what their court case was about was they had created this quote unquote documentary called Hillary's America that they were wanting to have aired during the 2007, I believe, yeah, 2007 primary season. Well, the FEC rightfully said, well, no, that's like electioneering. That's like basically one long anti-Hillary election ad,
Mm.
essentially.
Right, yeah.
And so they fought it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And that's when the Supreme Court gave us the Citizens United decision. So it was literally in order for the right wing to be able to change the rules in order to smear Hillary Clinton, we got the Citizens United decision. So that was like one of the many of these threads of things that started here, in the 80s and 90s and have continued and grown and metastasized up until what we have today.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So let's get back to the case, because I'm sure we'll circle back to this one more time. Let's get back to the case. So the wife, Mrs. is busy trying to get her husband out. This becomes a whole anti-Clinton's campaign in the 90s. They're running for president in 92. What happens after that?
So the RNC, the National Republican Party, launches what's called the Arkansas Project, which was basically sending operatives down to Arkansas to find any sources they could for any kind of dirt on the Clintons. No fact checking, no, there doesn't need to be any actual truth. They just need any kind of rumors they can get their hands on. And that's where we start to get the first roots of the scandals that would eventually turn into Watergate. Um, so as part of this whole, push to like bring up any little bit of dirt about the Clintons, any rumor, any allegation, the Wayne Dumond case comes up. And Wayne Dumond began to get sort of championed by the larger national right wing media as this poor victim of the Clintons, you
Yeah.
know, and so his case kind of got picked up by and spread among more and more people to the point where when Mike Huckabee became governor, so that in itself also ties back. So when Clinton became president, that meant the lieutenant governor of Arkansas at the time, Jim Guy Tucker, was promoted, so to speak, to acting governor. And so they had to have a new election to not only choose a new governor, but also a new lieutenant governor. Well, the new election happens. Jim Guy Tucker got elected governor, and by a squeaker, by an absolute squeaker, like 5,000 votes, Mike Huckabee got voted as lieutenant governor. And this was all thanks to the fact that he was an evangelical minister who had been recently appointed to head the Arkansas State Baptist Convention, which was the largest and most powerful coalition in Arkansas at the time. And so that having that backing by the conservative Christians was what enabled him to get into the office in the first place. Well, then Jim Guy Tucker ended up having to step down because he got caught up in the WhiteWater investigation and he got convicted. And if you're a convicted felon, you can't, by law, serve as Arkansas governor. So Jim Guy Tucker had to then step down, which meant Mike Huckabee moved up into the position of governor.
And then got elected for 2 terms on his own. So I think Mike Huckabee was in the governor's mansion for what? Almost a decade. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
he was there for a long time, as I
Yeah, but
recall.
not as long as Bill Clinton,
True,
which
true.
absolutely, I know, absolutely had to get under his skin. But one of the first things he did when he was sworn in was to say he was going to pardon Wayne Dumond. And this was kind of as the payback. His good buddy J. Cole had been pushing for, Wayne Dumond's cause for, at that point, over a decade. And so, because J. Cole had helped him get that Arkansas State Baptist Convention presidency, he kind of owed him. And so I feel like this was a case of like, okay, well, you helped me, now I'll help you. And so he announced pretty soon, like I want to say about a month after he was sworn in, that he was going to pardon Wayne Dumond. It didn't go smoothly, though. Like there were a lot of protests and petitions. And Ashley Stevens herself, along with her lawyer and a woman who had been sexually assaulted by Wayne years and years earlier, came to meet with Mike Huckabee personally. And in an interview afterwards, Ashley's lawyer said it was clear that Mike Huckabee had no clue of the actual facts of the case. He was spouting a lot of these talking points that had been circulating around in the right wing media that were just absolutely untrue.
Well, let's
Like
call
that
it
there
what it is,
was,
conspiracy theory.
yeah, exactly, exactly. It
Yeah.
was a conspiracy theory. And so Ashley had gotten really frustrated with Mike Huckabee and said she got up in his face, like inches away from his face, and said, I was this close to his face. I will never forget who he was. And that almost makes me think that after that, Huckabee, it was almost like a point of pride. Like he had to dig his heels in even further that this
Yes.
woman had gotten in his face and dared to like challenge him. So he chose to, believe these conspiracy theories and these wackadoo religious types and not the actual women who were telling him what actually happened. But he saw that there was a pushback. He saw that he wasn't going to be able to just pardon him and everyone would think it was great. So, in order to cover his own butt, he called an illegal meeting of the parole board and pressured them to parole Wayne so that Mike could step back and be like, oh, it wasn't me. The parole board paroled him. And not mentioning the fact that he had called a secret meeting in order to pressure them to do just that. So,
Right. So I guess that's kind of where the story ends then. He's released.
well, he's released, and not much later, he marries another woman. Dusty ended up passing away in a car accident. So he married another church going woman up in Kansas City. 6 weeks after their wedding, he raped and murdered a woman named Carol Sue Shields. Now, because there was no connection between him and his victim, they had to rely on DNA evidence. They found some of his DNA under her fingernails where she had fought. And so when you're, having to rely on that, sending it to, CODIS, it takes a while for it to find the hit or whatever. And
Right.
so while they were still waiting to get this DNA identification, he raped and murdered a second woman named Sarah, Sarah Andrasek. And literally the day afterwards was when the DNA results came back and he was arrested for Carol Sue Shields' murder. So And the sad thing is that they had occurred, those two murders had occurred in two different counties because, Kansas City is a big, sprawling metropolitan area across multiple counties. And
Right.
Carol Sue Shields had been in, oh my gosh, I can't remember, but it was in a different county than Sarah Andrusek's. And
Hmm.
so the prosecutor in Sarah Andrusek's county saw that Wayne was arrested and then he was tried and convicted and sentenced to life in prison for Carol Sue Shields' murder. Eric Zond, the Platte County prosecutor in Sarah Andrusek's case, I mean, rightfully, he figured there's no big rush. This guy's behind bars. He's never getting out, limited
Right.
resources, limited time. You got to focus on the dangers that are still out there. Well, before he could bring charges, Wayne died in prison. And so a lot of times when this story gets told, you hear about Carol Sue Shields, but you don't hear about Sarah Andrusek because her case never, he was never charged and it never went to trial, but she was indeed his second victim. So I always bring that up because I feel like it's important not to forget her.
Right. So we basically have these three women, this guy, these three women, all victims of this guy. And and the whole thing got used for political purposes.
Yeah. Yeah,
That yeah.
if she had been just another cheerleader who was no relation, had no connection to Bill Clinton, this would have never gotten to that point.
Yeah. That's that's a bit sobering if you stand back and kind of think about, that sort of thing. But I think also the sheer desperation of, the Republican Party at the time, especially leading up to the 1996 election, um, of trying to, find, heaven forbid we actually try to beat him in a fair election with a decent candidate, Bob Dole. But but if we can sink them in scandal, and people also forget. From this, you got WhiteWater, you get the Monica Lewinsky affair, you get the first modern impeachment since the Civil War. And you have, and let's face it, coming off of years of that did not make Al Gore's job in 2000 any easier.
Right.
And then we will not review the state of voting in Florida in the 2000 election. We could do a whole show on that.
Yes.
But I mean, yeah, yes, I mean, it's quite. I mean, yeah, it's quite. It's quite difficult and says that. I mean, that's yeah. But to your point, though, this is the roots of why so many people are on the right are convinced, the Clintons are, evil, dark people manipulating everything from behind the scenes, and it's it's a very difficult it's a very difficult thing. That's one of the things in 2016 when she was finally running, and to some degree, some of us will never forgive Obama for bumping her off in '08 because that would have been a better time for her to run. Um, is that, and I said kind of because I said this at the time. Here's the problem with Hillary Clinton. Everybody who was alive for the '90s already has an opinion about her. There's been so much stuff and so much of everyone. So you don't campaign through that. So much of it's already baked in. So then you're chasing after a minority of voters that don't somehow have an opinion about her.
Yeah.
Young people, sort of thing. Anybody born in about 1998 or 99 who wasn't, president, this is their first election sort of thing, and they don't have an opinion yet. You're chasing them, sort of thing, because everyone else, already has a baked in opinion about her. And it's kind of interesting. You say, like, this is kind of how that all started.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
real butterfly flaps in a forest causes a war in China thing, is
Yeah.
you know.
Well, and it does help that the butterfly flapping its wings is getting picked up and amplified by this whole ecosystem, this whole media ecosystem that is designed. Like it started, I try to kind of lay it out. I call it the pipeline of bullshit, where you get the most unhinged allegations, conspiracy theories, whatever, on like blogs or people's AM talk radio shows, something where they're,
Newsletters, yeah.
yeah, yeah. And it gets picked up by the ostensibly more real, quote unquote, journalists like
Yeah.
in the New York Times or the Washington Post, or, even among the bigger platforms of AM radio like Rush Limbaugh, for example. And people, I don't think, really appreciate how much the religious community played into this. Like, J. Cole was not the only fundamentalist preacher who was preaching against the Clintons and repeating these conspiracy theories to their congregations. Like, this was a huge factor, and it was a huge factor in getting since 1980, every
Mhm.
Republican, they have to sort of, court that demographic, so to speak. I guess
No,
court
no.
is the best word for it, but
No, I mean and I think also people. I mean, one first, I have two things to say. One is, so many parallels to today in terms of media ecosystem. We've been having a lot of conversations, um, in my circle of journalists, and we've been talking about, one of the things the left really lacks is the robustness of independent media that the right has, and it really makes Republicans' jobs, really Donald Trump's job, a lot easier because Donald Trump says something at 12:01 and it's on every right-wing Twitter account by 12:15,
yeah,
sort of thing. And the left just doesn't have that type of media infrastructure. Never has, really. I mean,
yeah,
never. I mean, we've had 40 years to get this right. Never have. And that was, I mean, people don't understand. Like, I grew up evangelical. I went to a Free Will Baptist church in Goshen, Arkansas. Growing up, that was our church in Arkansas. I mean, we lived in a town that wasn't even a town; it was just a place marker. We were excited when we got a left turn lane and sign off of 412 that said Nob Hill that way. Um, and
I know the exact sign you're talking about.
Yes, yeah, yeah, yes. And if you just turn left on that road and you go 2/10 of a mile and look across the valley, that's my grandma's house.
Oh, wow.
And and that's I spent most of my childhood in that house. My aunt owns it now and is renting it. Um, and that little area only has a gas station, and it used to have a Patrick's Diner. I'm sure that's gone. I haven't been down there in 10 years. But people do not understand, like, especially leading into the 2000 election, George Bush, all this type of thing. The right wing media ecosystem was in full gear and full tilt. The evangelical system and money were in full tilt for the 2000 election. They had had 8 long years sitting under sitting under Bill Clinton to get pissed off, and they were going to shoehorn George W. Bush into the White House by hook or by crook, which is why it's ever so convenient that the state that has the voting issue happens to be ran by the candidate's brother.
Yeah,
Wonderful. That's if you're the GOP, this is the type of luck you can rely on. And
yeah,
and so and that rolled really deep. And by that time, the well had really been poisoned. A lot of narratives were already kind of out there. And I think people don't understand. I'm so glad you brought it up. It's one of those, if you kind of didn't grow up in evangelical circles, you don't really understand how kind of like lockstep people get into this is our guy, this is our candidate. Everyone, they get their talking points together. They're all saying the same thing, and people are always amazed with like Trump and how much of his stuff gets hand waved. And I'm kind of like, no, this isn't new. It's
right.
not. They've been hand waving Republican candidates. They literally ran a guy in Alabama to run for senator who had recently, not distant past, recently been arrested for raping somebody. Like, if
Yeah.
you're the guy and you get the what people online call the magic R next to your name,
Hmm.
they will just line up behind you because you're their guy.
Yeah, and
You
also
know,
because you couldn't, no matter how bad it is, it's
yeah,
not as bad as the Democrats. They have been smearing the Democrats
yes,
to where literally they are saying and have been saying for decades now that the Democrats are literally in league with Satan.
yes,
Like Mike Huckabee, he doesn't say the crazy thing of like Hillary Clinton is a Satanist, although plenty of right wingers do say that.
they sure
But
do.
he says the more like acceptable version of that, which is like, well, if you're for all this perversion and baby killing and destroying the family and anti-religion, then what are you if not working for Satan? Like that's literally how. So it doesn't matter how bad your guy is, like you said, they
Right,
can't possibly be as bad as the Democrats. And that's why, myself and people probably like yourself who have lived through all this, when we saw that Hillary was getting the nomination, I just was like, oh my God, like, do they not have a clue how hated she is? Like, I know people who are fairly progressive, they're
yeah.
not necessarily evangelicals or anything like that, but they couldn't bring themselves to vote for Hillary because she's just so crooked. She's just so shady.
Well,
And it's like, well,
and one of
what
the
exactly?
yes, yeah. Well, and here's the thing is one of the issues with them, and this story kind of demonstrates this. The Whitewater thing demonstrates it really well. The Clintons have a very bad habit of doing things that aren't necessarily illegal but don't look good.
Yeah.
And they make the Republicans' job really easy by doing a lot of stuff that isn't illegal but doesn't look good. That can be very easily turned and parlayed into a scandal with a skeleton of truth and a flesh of lies. Um, and that, for someone like her who is incredibly politically ambitious, and that's not a bad thing. I'm not afraid of people who are politically ambitious. That's fine. But for someone who's politically ambitious, they didn't necessarily always comport themselves, particularly sort of post White House, in a way that honored that.
Yeah.
And that gets into the Clinton Foundation and some of the money with Haiti. And we're about to go through all that again because of getting into USAID funding and all this sort of thing. And so look for that. I'll be covering it on the news hour here soon, I'm sure. And so they definitely don't do themselves any favor and kind of do the GOP stuff for them. But you're absolutely right. And that was my thing in 2016 is I'm totally down with her, but here's the problem. Everybody over 40 or what are we really kind of over 35 has an opinion about her.
Yeah.
Already there's too much in the air in the ecosystem. And I think there's a lot of probably older, GOP evangelical people, who, for them, I think, if it had been, Trump versus anybody else, Trump probably would have had a harder time. But when you
Yeah.
have a galvanizing, politicized figure like her, it's
Yeah.
very easy for a lot of apolitical people who don't care to vote for the other guy just because it's not her.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think that and I also I also think gender has something to do with it. We just lived through that again. Um, sort of thing. I think that also was a factor as well. But she was just such a polarizing figure. And to your point, a lot of that is the right wing smear machine coming out of the 90s through AM talk radio, through email newsletters, through all of the, through the whole evangelical, church system, especially churches who like to preach from newspapers and not the Bible, made that possible. And for better or for worse, the Democratic Party just doesn't do that. It doesn't operate that
Yeah.
way at
Yeah.
all. And so it's, it's, but I mean, this is, yeah, I'm so glad that you have cataloged this and written this story because, like I said, the moment I saw it, I could not have replied faster, and sort of thing, because yeah, it is where it all begins, and it's a quite um I think it's quite shocking because there's elements of good old-fashioned Southern corruption married with an intrinsic desire on the part of evangelicals to destroy Clinton's political career.
Yes,
Um,
exactly.
and
And the
there's
dangers
yeah,
that conspiracy theories cause. Like that was kind of my whole
true.
through line
Yeah.
was that, I've known people who believe all kinds of conspiracy theories, but
Yeah.
drug running in Mina or aliens building the pyramids or, whatever.
Right.
And it's all fine. Like people can hold whatever beliefs that they want to believe. But I believe it was Voltaire that said those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And that's
Yes.
the thing is that with these conspiracy theories, they can cause real harm to people's lives. And so that's why I
Well, that's
start the book
Pizzagate.
with Pizzagate. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then go back to talk about sort of the first use case, is what I call it, the first use case of the anti Clinton conspiracy theory complex.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think, and there's, I mean, I think people there are probably next to Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton's probably one of the most polarizing figures in American political history.
Yeah.
It's like Trump 1A, Hillary Clinton 1A1, sort of thing,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean it's just abs very polarized, and people I don't think understand, especially by the end after you got through WhiteWater, Monica, the impeachment. I mean, by the time they're ready to leave office in 99 2000, most hated women in America. I mean,
Yeah.
people talk about Trump derangement syndrome. Let's talk about Hillary Clinton derangement syndrome. like,
Yes.
but I think I think the sad thing is, and this is probably, I think this may be a criticism of all of us who do media on the left. We don't talk about these things. We don't couch it in that term. We don't talk, we don't come out and say, oh, you have, Hillary Clinton, or you have Democrat. We don't use that language. We don't talk that way. It's just not who we are.
Yeah.
And it makes the GOP's job incredibly easy,
Yeah.
you
Well, and we
know.
can thank Newt Gingrich for that. He came out with that memo in, I believe it was 91, that was language, a tool of control, where he explicitly told GOP candidates, office holders, what have you, to
Yeah.
use these very negative, polarizing terms to talk about their opponents. Terms like traitors, sick, perverts, hates America, like the most polarizing stuff. And they've been doing this since the 90s. And then,
Well,
no
that was
one,
the innovation Roger Ailes did with Fox News.
yes.
Roger Stone, the provocateur who did the Brooks Brothers riot at the 2000 election to stop the vote counting in West Palm Beach, Florida. Again, we could do a
Yeah.
whole podcast on the 2000 election, but I mean, all
Yeah.
that was the throughput of all those. I mean, that was Roger Stone's whole career, is going around saying extremely batshit insane things in order to get people to do crazy things, like getting 500 guys to basically lay siege to I just think it was Broward County, but to lay
Mhm.
siege to a voting office in Broward County to stop vote counting because for fear that they might find 450 votes for Al Gore in there. So I mean, this is all, yes, and now in the era of Trump, it's all of this on steroids with the aid of internet and social media, and that's
Yeah.
genuinely, genuinely frightening. Yes, we absolutely thank you, Newt Gingrich and Roger Ailes and Roger Stone, all these people, and people, I think people also forget the reason Roger Ailes wanted to start Fox News was he never wanted to see the media do to anybody else what happened to Richard Nixon over Watergate.
Yeah.
People forget that, and Roger Stone has on his back a full back tattoo of Richard Nixon. That's how much he loves Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
And Rogerson was the only person who was loosely affiliated with Watergate and used it as a bragging point and went around DC trying to get jobs because he'd been involved in, up until that time, the biggest, scandal in American political history that he used as a point of pride.
Yeah.
That's the time. And I think the frightening part is that's the people we're trying to run against, live in the country with, have political discussions with. And I think sometimes on the left, we get caught in these, very earnest proposals and policy and ideas and trying to make and improve society. And I don't think a lot of Democrats realize that's not the game we're playing, and haven't been playing it for quite some time, if we're being honest.
Oh
You
yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah.
um, and I just love your book lays the foundation for that.
Well, thank
So
you.
that's
It was a
yeah,
lot to cover.
it was a lot to cover, but yes, it's and just I mean, I wish, this type of journalism, I wish it was invested in more. I wish, I mean, you should be having this conversation on Good Morning America. So thank you for slumming it down here with me. But I mean,
Not at
really,
all.
yeah, I mean, really, I mean, this is the time when I talk about our society is lacking in quality journalism. This is what I'm talking about. This is the stuff that is actually really is worth being talked about and is looking at things in this really important, objective way, and understanding, and because you do a very similar thing to what I do, is I'm kind of like, okay, that's a thing, but let's put it in context. What came
Yes.
before it?
Yeah. Where
And
is this coming from?
yes,
Yeah.
and you oftentimes find out whatever the scandal du jour has roots elsewhere.
Hmm.
And that's always what we're trying to do at the Cameron Journals, provide context. So like I said, I ran, not walked to your book. But
I
thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Yes, thank you so much. We're almost at the top of the hour. So let's do this. Why don't you tell me your plugs and where to find you online and buy the book online?
Sure, you can buy the book anywhere you purchase books online. Bookshop.org is a really good place if you don't want to support certain oligarchs.
Yep.
But you can also buy it there as well.
Yes.
And you can find me on Blue Sky and on Facebook, and I'm D.R. Bartlette, Bartlette, on all of those socials.
Awesome. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you.